Hey, welcome back to the channel. This is OncaEngineering, and I'm Herman Wiegman. And today is the part 2 about sticking a ported supercharger into a Jaguar F-Type AJ126 engine. Let's get stuck in. The first step I found was to prepare the ported supercharger for installation in the car. And here I painted my supercharger black, so it's kind of obvious which one's which. The original equipment supercharger in this video will be silver. But the first thing I found was the bypass valve and installing that back into the ported supercharger. But I also found that there's an adjustment screw, and that's to prevent the bypass valve from getting stuck in the bypass throat. And so it's a fine adjustment, but it's an important one. Otherwise, your supercharger might get stuck on boost, and that's no fun. The next step in preparing the ported supercharger for installation was to add the bypass valve motor and the pressure sensor, which is all very nice, pleasurable work. It's just great to screw things back together again and prepare that for installation in the car. It's kind of fun. The next step for me was to insert the guide pins back into the supercharger and make sure they were greased. I also took an opportunity to clean the threads on all the supercharger bolts, especially the long ones. Those seem to collect a lot of debris and corrosion because they aren't protected from the environment. Now I have a means of raising the hood off the car by pulling it up towards the ceiling in this garage. And so I like to do that because it makes the job so much easier. Because this job focused just on the supercharger, I decided to only drain the radiator port, which was sufficient to get 1.5 gallons or 6 liters out of the car, which was just perfect. I also extracted the coolant that was inside the charge air coolers by using a little bit of compressed air, and I guess you know what's going to happen. Yep, that's why I wear my play clothes. The next step is disconnecting the supercharger from all the engine components. And I usually start in the left rear, disconnecting vacuum lines, manifold sensors, the symposer bracket from the rear of the car. And it's a little bit easier for me because I didn't secure that back with all the screws that it came with the last time around. So it's much easier, much quicker now for me to disconnect the supercharger. Now this time around, my second removal of a supercharger, I was much more familiar with all the bits and bobs. But I did do a best practice where some of the other folks on the YouTube universe, they write down a precise set of instructions, what they took off next, sort of a list of removal, if you will. So as I was removing PCV hoses, vacuum lines, electrical connectors, fuel lines, I wrote it down in a nice list, and that made obviously reassembly much easier. Now, the front of the engine, where there's a wire harness, there's coolant hoses, and the intake plenums, there's a little bit of a process. First is the wire harness, and you really need a pick to help you make the disconnections of those connectors because of the latches on the underside of the connectors. And the coolant hose on the front by the water pump kind of half comes off before you take the intake center plenum off, and then you can get the rest of the coolant hoses off. So it's a bit of a back and forth dance. The next step in the process is to remove the front crossover pipe, or W pipe. And this is the metal pipe, and if your car still has the plastic pipe, please change it right along with the Y pipe job. I'll put a link in the description so that you can change out the Y pipes and really save yourself a lot of future hassle. Either way, once the W pipe is out of the way, the supercharger belt can be released, and then that can be put aside so that the supercharger can be removed. The next step for me was to remove the throttle body from the intake of the supercharger. There is a coolant hose that runs underneath the supercharger to the rear crossover pipe. Just be cognizant of that. Now, to this point, there's very little hardware that's been removed from the engine, but I do bag it and container it just to keep it all in nice order, as well as all the components removed from the engine are placed on the roof of the car in logical order. So it just makes it sort of a natural process during reassembly. The next step is removing the charge air cooler from the top of the supercharger. And this is really the fun part, where you're removing lots of bolts and you feel like you're actually getting somewhere. But I did take a moment here. You'll see that I spray the long bolts on the front of the supercharger. I watch a lot of Jaguar engine repair videos on YouTube, and it just amazes me how many people have trouble with these long bolts. And sometimes, they shear them off at the threads, so be careful. Now it's finally time to remove the supercharger, and to do that you have to disconnect 2 of the long bolts in the front. Those are done. Now there's 6 more bolts, and there's 2 guide pins holding the supercharger onto the block of the engine. And you have to loosen it up, and you can use rubber mallets, and I eventually use a pry bar underneath the intake runner just to help me loosen the 2 guide pins up and then remove the supercharger. Now I finally have a chance to compare the 2 superchargers on the bench side by side. Now outwardly there's no real difference between the units, besides one being painted black, the ported unit, versus the OEM in silver. But there is a grip tech pulley on one, which is the 58mm, versus the other, which is the OEM stock 62mm, and that does buy you a 7% increase in supercharger speed. Now the real difference is in the intake area and smoothness that you can see while looking down the throat of the 2 superchargers. There's also a small bit of difference on the outflow side where there is some porting on the unit on the right. And this is what you're really paying for, to get that increase in power and airflow. Now there's a few bits and bobs we have to take care of before we can install the new supercharger. And the first is the dowel pins. It depends on your car. In mine, the dowel pins were stuck in the block, and they were the OEM style that I liked, so I decided to keep them there. And that also meant that I had to remove the stainless steel dowel pins that came back from Jokerz and VAP inside the ported unit, so I took those off, but I did damage the pins, unfortunately. So I'm dedicated to using the OEM ones that are still in my block. And one last final detail is to get the Symposer blanking plate on the manifold before throwing it back in the car. It's just so much easier to do it out here. Now, while installing the unit, I did prepare by putting 4 long bolts in, as well as a bunch of cotton rags into the intake runners, just to keep things from falling in. And the unit just pops right on, and hopefully it slides right down on the guide pins that are in there. While I was installing the supercharger, I was very careful, and I, started installing my 6 bolts that hold the manifolds down to the block. And when I got to the last one with my torque wrench, the bolt sheared on me. I was shocked. But because it's sandwiched between 2 other bolts, I'm going to stick with it and not replace it. I'll keep it for the future, but I'm going to keep a mental note that there's a busted bolt on my manifold. Now, after shearing one bolt off in the manifold, I didn't want to lose another, so I added some anti-seize to these long bolts in the front, which hold the charge air cooler down but also hold the manifold to the block. And so with the extra anti-seize I felt better. But even then, you'll see here that the one on the right hand side of the car I had trouble with, and so I got rid of the power tool and I screwed that one in by hand to make sure that it didn't shear. Now, something that some people have trouble with is getting the supercharger belt aligned properly over the idler pulleys and the drive pulleys. So I usually like to check that just to make sure I don't strip my belt. And the final part of assembly, of course, is to test your work. Start it up, add some cooling fluid. It's always a great feeling when it all comes together. No leaks, no fuel leaks, no coolant leaks. All the electrical signals are there, so another job well done. All right, let's go over the tools in this job. Pretty straightforward. few nut drivers, a few wrenches, 17 millimeters for the fuel lines, various bits and bobs on the ratchet set, a few picks, and of course my guide pins that help the alignment of the supercharger onto the intake manifolds. And of course a torque wrench, and it's always trusty to have a nut driver. Well, this is one part left over. This goes into my left hand side intake manifold, and this bolt sheared, even though I was applying less than 24 Newton meters of torque to it. And so I don't know why this bolt broke on me, but I'm running without it. So let's see if I get any air leaks. To test the results, I decided to do a 0 to 60 run or two. And it was a cold day, and there was salt on the road, and the tires weren't gripping, and my, clutch throttle slash, rear tire grip wasn't synchronized. But I was comfortably within 5 seconds, 0 to 60, so that felt pretty good. And overall, the car actually felt pretty civilized. I used to have a weird sort of idle return vacillation, and that went away. I didn't know if it was because of my adjustment to the bypass valve or the tune, but either way, I was very satisfied. The real question is, what's the bang for the buck of porting? Now, if it's associated with a rebuild that you already need, it's not so bad, but if you're like me and you sit there and rebuilt a unit that was already good, it's pretty expensive. But otherwise, it's a $1,400 option with about a 60-65 horsepower gain, which is around $23 per horsepower, which isn't too bad. I like it because it's optimizing what's already on the car. I said before that Kevin Shane had been in touch with me from Chicago, and he has a beautiful black-on-black F-Type. But if you look real closely, you'll see that he has two-piece rotors from VAP. And so what did he do with his old calipers? He sent them to me. So now I have his old 380 millimeter front and 376 millimeter rear calipers. And with all this newfound engine power comes great responsibility. So you'll probably be seeing an upgrade in the near future. And I just want to say thank you, Kevin, because just for a moment, it felt like there was still goodwill in the world. So, Merry Christmas. So before we wrap up this video on the ported supercharger install and operation, I did want to fill in a few gaps. I did have to upgrade or upload a new tune to the car to take advantage of the porting options. And so that was using the VAP V-Flash tool. That was pretty straightforward. If you want to learn more about that flashing process, you can look back about 5 episodes or so where I go over how I upgraded to my tune on this car, manual V6. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. And I do want to say that there's going to be some good projects coming up in 2026. I'm probably going to do something with the big brakes, because with more engine power, it's nice to have more braking power. Another thing I was looking at was manual transmissions for these cars. Looking at that, doing a teardown, doing an inspection, talk about the synchros. Is there anything we can do with those? 1 or 2 members on YouTube have been contacting me about concern. They're having issues shifting from first to second. So it sounds like the synchros are worn out. So maybe I'll look into that. Otherwise, I do want to say that the rear diffs, particularly the Quaife-equipped helical geared differentials, or ATBs, automatic torque biasing units, we have another batch coming. And this batch is going to be a bit more polished, a bit more professional, and so there will be differentials available. And I know some of you are hanging on because you're having issues with your limited slip or whichever differential you have in your Jaguar or Land Rover product. And so these differentials will be available in 2026. And so look forward to that. But otherwise, why don't you share with me what interests you about the JLR products, and what sort of videos do you think I could help produce? So I'm soliciting input. Otherwise, I'm pretty satisfied with my Jaguar F-Type. It's a proper gentleman sports car, and I've pretty much addressed all the weak points that I know of that tickled me. So what tickles you? What would you like to see perhaps happening next? All right, so all the best. And remember, my friends, drive well.